Right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back from lunch. I'm Eddie Blair, without an E. And as I was saying to someone over lunch, they said, oh, like Eddie Reader from Fairground Attraction. I said, no, Eddie Blair, like Tony Blair, there's no E at the end of Blair. There is an E at the end of Eddie. So, gosh, it takes so much effort sometimes. Anyway, I worked for many years on oncology and infectious disease and thought that was the coolest place for pharmacogenomics in my time at GSK and Bristol Myers. But it was only when I moved to the neurosciences group at UCB, I began to understand just what fantastic advances were being made and continue to be made in neurodegenerative disease such as Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. So it's a thrill to be chairing a session that looks at neuropsychiatric disorders beyond neurodegeneration into other areas. So for first speaker, and this is a particular pleasure for me because I'm vice chair of a patient public voice panel at East Genomics. So it's a real pleasure to have a patient voice. And we're going to hear from Portia Thorman, who's going to talk about the patient's perspective on standard of care for spinal muscular atrophy. Now, Portia, before she got involved in all this SMA stuff, she has a degree in psychology and then was a primary school teacher. So she's properly battle-hardened. And so it's a treat to hear you talk about SMA. Portia, please.
It's my clicker. Hello, everybody. It's a real privilege to be here today and to bring the patient perspectives to such a handsome group of academics. So thank you for having me. So I'm advocacy lead for SMA UK. Spinal muscular atrophy, for those of you that maybe don't know, is a progressive condition. It affects all the muscles in your body, including muscles needed for swallowing, for breathing, for walking, everything. The most severe form of SMA is SMA type 1, and just 6 years ago, all children born with SMA type 1 would have died by the time they were 2 years old. So we're a small UK-based charity. I won't read this all out. So our job is to advocate for good services, treatments, access to treatment services, therapies. We also support our community from newborn babies to adults living with the SMA throughout the spectrum of SMA, from type 1 to type 4. Today, I'm going to talk about this end bit of the first paragraph here. How do we ensure best management for everyone living with SMA, which has been further complicated by these fantastic new treatments we have. So I said 6 years ago, there was no treatment for SMA. It's a progressive disease, and 60% of those children would have died before they're 2. Now we have 3 treatments, one of which is a gene replacement therapy. Another, it's called Zolgensma. Spinraza, which is an intrathecal lumbar puncture that the person living with SMA has to have 3 times a year for their entire life. And another is Diplan, which is an oral treatment. Now, this is fantastic, and children are living. So here's the traditional spectrum of SMA from 1 to 4. Now, I really hate it when these are put in boxes, because it's not type 1, type 2, type 3, type 4. It's very much a spectrum. So we go from sitters to walkers. And actually, now that we have treatment, we're seeing children with type 1 growing up and actually fitting into from this end of the spectrum to that end of the spectrum, depending on when they were diagnosed, when they had symptom onset, crucially, when they were treated. We're seeing a whole, so it's very inequitable in the UK at the moment. If I introduce you to a few, this little girl is in Scotland. She was treated at just 5 weeks old. She is walking. She is following normal developmental patterns. This little chap, Rocco, as you can see, is beginning to walk. I think he's 5 years old here. He's Spinraza treated, so not had gene therapy, but beginning to walk. But he's completely peg-fed, so can't swallow. Never had any respiratory issues, really. Had a bit of bowel issues. Then we have twins, Rafi and Sid. These guys have 3 copies of the SMN protein, unlike Rocco, who's got 2. This little girl's got 2. So they're eating. They were treated at 1 year old, so treated quite late, but eating, not walking. No reliance on any kind of ventilation, these guys. Rocco is reliant on BiPAP overnight. These are all type 1. And I'd like to introduce you to this little chap, Ezra. He's my son. So Ezra is now 6. Ezra is completely peg-fed. He is reliant on BiPAP overnight. He is not mobile at all. He drives a little power chair around. He's at mainstream school, really clever little boy. These kids are all very clever, it seems. But in Ezra's first 3 years of life, we had 10 PICU admissions for respiratory distress. Every time he got a cold, even a little sniffle, he would be blue lighted up to the Evelina for intubation until he got over that cold. So our first 2 years were pretty much spent in hospital. Now, all these children are living at the same time in space, you know, and it has completely depended on not on which treatment they've got, but on how quickly they've been treated. And along with that, we have other variables. So actually, Ezra and Rocco, both on Spinraza, but Rocco's doing very much more better. Now, is that because Rocco wasn't so poorly as a child and has had intensive physiotherapy, intensive hydrotherapy, or is that because of some biological difference? We don't know at the moment. So how do we do a standard of care for the whole SMA population? It's really quite hard when we have all these variables, but there is a need for it, especially with social media. I'm part of lots of groups of SMA families, as you can imagine, especially with new treatment, when everything's so new. It's kind of evolving. Management is evolving all the time, and different geographical areas are trying out different techniques with these children. And to the families living it, it seems like an inequity, because they're like, hang on a minute, why have you got a spinal brace? I haven't got a spinal brace. Do I need a spinal brace? But then in the background, clinicians are saying, spinal braces, yes, they're good for supporting you and sitting, but are they restricting that muscle development? Now we've got treatment, we need to be working those muscles. So sticking in a sinus brace, is that going to help? It might improve their quality of life, being able to sit up, but we need time out of it. So all these ideas are going around the clinicians at the moment. That's my little Ezra there. Respiratory function is much more difficult to measure, it seems, and all the tests you go for. So Spinraza and Risdiplam are currently on a managed access agreement, which means they are still collecting data about the outcomes for these children. That means we have to go to regular physio assessments at the specialist hospitals. And they assess mainly movement tasks, strength and movement. Can you move this weight from here to here? They don't assess any other aspect of SMA, including the most important one to me, which is respiratory function. We're finding that these Zolgensma-treated babies who were treated early enough are now not reliant on BiPAP overnight, which is fantastic. But they've still got SMA. They weren't treated pre-symptomatically. And when they get poorly with nasty viruses like RSV, they're ending up having to go into hospital, sometimes into intensive care. Yet they don't qualify for the RSV vaccine because they're not on BiPAP ventilation. And I speak to mums, and they almost want a BiPAP so that they can get RSV. And I was like, if a doctor told me my son didn't need BiPAP ventilation overnight, I'd be like, woohoo, he doesn't need ventilation. But they want it so they can get access to this other things. So you have to really look at the way the NHS is working. Now we have these new treatments. Emergency care plans is another thing. New treatments. They're doing really well, but they go into their local hospital. It's a rare disease. Local doctors don't know what SMA is. They don't know things like you can't over-rely on oxygen because it's about mucus filling up your lungs. You need to get that out. They don't know how to deal with it. And families with treated children that don't have a ventilator, like my son, they don't have an emergency care plan. They don't know what the signs of respiratory distress are. They don't know what to do. So that's when charities like SMA UK have to step in, and we've created, with clinicians, a generic emergency care plan for those living with SMA that they can take into their local hospitals, so those hospitals know what to do. Because the communication between local hospitals and the specialist hospitals is not brilliant. We mustn't forget the adults living. Is there any sound on this one? Do we have sound? Ah, there we go. Oh, that's not the sound.
500 forwards and 500 backwards on the handbike. These are my 3 different types of bands. Since taking Spinraza a year ago, I've got a lot stronger, particularly on pulling exercises. The green band is the hardest band, and I've been using this a lot more. For some, I've just upgraded the band, but for most of these pulls, I've got a lot stronger, and the movement has got much wider as well. I've noticed my stamina's been a lot better, and I make my exercises as varied as possible. This keeps it fun and enjoyable, but also wears me out every time, as you can see by the end of this exercise. So
that's Maxwell. He lives with SMA type 2. The key to having the best outcomes with treatment for SMA is working on muscles. Now, adults living with SMA possibly didn't have access to any physio before this, because there was almost like, what's the point? It's a progressive disease. So it's opened lots of new doors with them. And managed access agreements mean they have to be assessed, so they are getting access to physio that way. But the expectations were high for adults. They thought they were going to get back things that they'd lost, and that's not necessarily true, because once the neurons have died, they're not going to come back. But possibly with dual therapies, we have anti-myostatins in the pipework. With the SMN targeting drugs, that's a really exciting opportunity. So there's more that we can be done. But the outcomes are varied. Again, just like in the family population, it would be great to know, why are these outcomes so varied? Why are these treatments having better outcomes on some than they are on others? So looking forward, what we want to do is create a new standards of care for SMA in the UK, something that the whole community can refer to. And it's going to involve getting working groups together, the clinicians working in these areas, and coming and discussing their practice, sharing what they do, talking about case studies, finding out what's working, and creating a new document. And then hopefully, because there's an awful lot of disciplines within SMA, everyone can come together and we can find the best way forward. And we'll have to look internationally as well at this. If we have that, along with using technology to improve communication, there's big disputes between private physios and NHS physios. Private physios want to use these flexor suits, lycra suits, and move away from the traditional orthotics. NHS physios, they're saying, we're not sure if that works. So we need to come together and share evidence and improve communication. There's personalised physiotherapy apps. There is not the capacity in the UK for physiotherapy that this community needs. My son, since COVID, his physiotherapy has been incredibly sporadic, less and less all the time. So apps that we could use, that the specialists can give us a program and we can follow it and we can share it with our local physios, that would be a great step forward, and it is happening. We have the Reach UK network, so the top clinicians working in SMA all get together. SMA UK have representatives on there, sharing what they're finding out. All these things are really helping develop the care plans for SMA. Working closely with patient groups, of course. And just providing safe spaces. Before I worked for SMA UK, I started a WhatsApp group, and it was just me and a couple of other mums that happened to be at the Evelina at the same time, after sitting by the hospital bed all day. We'd go out for a drink, and that was 5 years ago when my son was a baby. That has grown now to over 40 families living with SMA type 1, which is quite a large number for a rare disease. But because so little is known, they're putting videos of their children on there in respiratory distress, saying, what shall I do? What can I do about this? You're having this drug. And it's getting, it gets dangerous, basically, because they're swapping medical information. So SMA UK have made safe, moderated WhatsApp groups. So these families and these communities and these adults can get together, they can talk about their care, and our outreach workers are on there as well, and they can make sure that everybody stays safe. So if we got to a place where, we had all this happening, I think that would be great for everyone living with SMA. So thank you for listening, and please feel free to reach out to me.